So this last session will be about refugee camps, and you all know about them. They are now one of the emblematic figure of the migrant crisis in Europe, but they take a great variety of forms, of statuses. They are very diverse, so we need to know more about them. To what extent are those camps something else than spaces of exception? To what extent can they become cities, or can they become integrated into cities? So to discuss all those issues, we will have two speakers and then one discussant. The first speaker is Kamel Doraï, who is a researcher at CNRS and Institut français du Proche Orient. I don't know how to translate that, but there's probably an English name for this institute. It's written there, French Institute for the Near East. Okay, so the word is yours for 20 minutes. Thank you.
So thanks for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to present some of my recent works on refugee camps in the Middle East. So, well, my presentation is a part of a larger project that is funded by the French ANR since 1.5 years. It's a research program entitled Time of Conflict, Time of Migration, where we have a whole set of researchers working on the issue of comparing several refugee camp experiences in the Middle East with a comparative study between Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. Well, personally, I've been working on the Palestinian refugee camp since now nearly 20 years. In Lebanon and in Jordan, and I have conducted several studies in Lebanon, Syria before the conflict, and currently now I'm based in Jordan, and I'm working on trying to compare the different kinds of refugee camps in the region and the different kind of settlement of refugees in this region. Well, I think that the Middle East is a very interesting place to study refugee camps and refugee settlement, and especially the link between forced migration and urban growth is very, very important in the Middle East. Just to give you an example, the city of Amman, that is now composed of nearly 3 million inhabitants, is inhabited by 70% of the inhabitants are from Palestinian origin, so are refugees. It has been created in the mid-90s by Circassian refugees living a place close to Chechnya and have settled in Jordan. So it's really a city that has been growing with the arrival of refugees and forced migrants. So first Circassians, and then a large part of it are Palestinians, and more recently Iraqis and Syrians. And we can just have like the same kind of analysis for cities like Beirut, cities like Damascus, and of course many cities currently in Iraq. The other very interesting point while studying the Middle East is the fact that these countries are not signatory of the Geneva Convention. So the refugees are not recognized. They don't have a proper legal status. You have nothing called asylum seekers, refugees as such. So there is a blurring category between all these different forced migrants that sometimes are considered as refugees, sometimes are considered as migrants, as guests, as illegal migrants. And the result, in terms of urban, from an urban perspective, is that most of them, their informal legal status result in an informal settlement in the city. So there is a link between the precarious legal status and the precarious forms of settlement in the urban settings. It means that in many, many places in the Middle East, and especially in Amman, in Beirut, that I will talk about today, you have an articulation in certain neighborhoods of different kinds and different forms of migrants. And I will show you more precisely with some examples, specifically in Beirut, of this fact. You have internal migrants, internal forced displaced person linked to different wars, refugees, and new economic migrants coming from abroad in the same neighborhoods. And so it gives a special urban setting. The urban fabric is really linked to this articulation of several forms of migration population in the same neighborhoods. The other very important element in the Middle East is the huge presence of refugees in the cities. Just to give you an example, in Lebanon today, 25% of the population are Syrian refugees. It means that more than 1.5 million Syrian refugees arrived since 2011 for an overall population of 4 million and something. And most of them are urban refugees. So they live in the main cities of Beirut. In Jordan now it's considered that there is around 15% of the population that are Syrian refugees. So we talk about huge numbers. We talk about cities whose size have doubled in 5 years. So it's something that is extremely, extremely, extremely important in terms of demographic impact. Also, there is another very interesting thing in the Middle East, the coexistence between official camps that are managed by international organizations such as UNHCR, and for the Palestinians they have a specific organization, UNRWA, and a lot of spaces that are considered by the refugees and by the population as camps, but are not officially registered as camps. So it's informal neighborhoods, inhabited mostly by refugees, but without any real legal status and without any real international organization taking care of infrastructure, of assistance inside these spaces. The other very determinant element in the Middle East is the role of the Palestinian experience. When we talk about refugees in the Middle East, it is considered that these refugees are Palestinians. It's the only group that has a legal status as refugees for different host states. And everything is seen and read through the lenses of the Palestinian experience. Most of the countries were reluctant to open any new refugee camp in the region. For example, during the Iraqi crisis after the fall of Saddam Hussein, there was no refugee camp opened in the Middle East for one reason. The Middle Eastern states considered that if they open a refugee camp, it means that the refugees will settle permanently, as it is still the case with the Palestinians. So there is a link between Palestinian camp and permanent settlement that is quite uncommon for other regions or other experiences. And we have to have in mind that everything that is a camp can be, for the authorities, a way of settling permanently the refugees. That's why very strict regulation had been imposed on the recently opened Syrian camps in Jordan, as I will show you later on. So this means that we can build on the Palestinian experience and combining it with the Syrian experience now to try to read what are these urban settings, and can we consider it as refugee camp as space of exceptions. There is a whole debate following several works of, for example, of Michel Agier on this, or for the Palestinians on Sari Hanafi works. And some of the people consider that it's a space of exception because it has specific regulation and because the people living inside have a specific legal status. Still, we have a real specific regulation for the camps. But on the other way around, as I will show you in the several examples, informality transforms these spaces and circumvent all this legal restriction imposed by the states. The second element that we can say that it's not really now a space of exception, that most of the inhabitants of these camps are not anymore only refugees. In the camp of Shatila in Beirut, most of the inhabitants are non-Palestinians. They can be Syrians, they can be Iraqis, they can be Bangladeshi, they can be Filipino, Sri Lankan, and so on and so forth. So there is a form of urban integration of these spaces. They play a specific role in the organization of the city. And this is very important because these places, it's places where you have a lot of people coming from outside and inside the camp. You have daily mobility from the camp to the city, to work, for example. They play a specific economic role because there are no taxes inside the camp. You don't pay any tax when you open a shop inside a refugee camp. It's a safe place for illegal migrants because the police, for example, in Lebanon does not enter the camps. It's not allowed. So they have their own specific regulation inside the camp. So a lot of illegal migrants, they end in refugee camp. So they can be considered as a place of entry to the city for most of the poor migrants who come from abroad. The first place where poor migrants like Filipino, Bangladeshi, Iraqi, Syrians, when they arrive in Beirut, they first go to a refugee camp, they settle for a short period of time, and then they can access to the rest of the city. So they play a role like it's an entry point for most of the refugees inside the city. So I will just divide the 10 minutes left with developing two different aspects. The first one is the Palestinian experience, and I will focus most on Lebanon and on the urban integration of refugee camps inside the city, giving you several examples of how formally these refugee camps are now part of the cities. And as a second example, I will present you the situation of the biggest Syrian refugee camp in Jordan, Zaatari, that is in the north, very close to the Syrian border. It's a refugee camp that has been opened in July 2012, and now there is around 80,000 inhabitants in the camp today. And to try to, I work, and I will show you later on, but I work with a group of architects. We try to make like comparison of different methods of social sciences and architecture. So I work with a group of architects on the making of a city, and on especially with a focus on at a very small scale. We work on housing of refugees and the evolution of housing of refugees. And through these individual cases, we try to have a more broad reflection on how the city is made by the refugees themselves. Well, this is in the southern suburbs of Beirut, at the limit of the southern suburbs of Beirut. It's a very, very small refugee camp that is called Mar El-Yes. And as you can see, it's really now completely integrated in the city, even if on the map that you can see, on the photo that you can see, it's very, very dense compared to the other parts of the same neighborhood. And what is interesting is that you can see in the two pictures the evolution between when the camp has been created in beginning of the 50s, so it's 70 years ago now, and what it looks like 2 months ago when I was there. The camp has completely become an urban place with very dense area. So this is one example of the way it has completely changed from tents in the suburb of the city. And now it's in the heart of the city, and it's becoming dense and with huge buildings built inside inside the camp. So we really have this was just to show you that as an urban, it's completely integrated in the urban landscape of Beirut. For those who know Beirut, it looks like many, many other poor neighborhoods of the city. This is another example of Shatila. Most of you know Shatila for the massacre in 1982. It's a camp that has been destroyed, completely destroyed 2 times in its history, during the 80s, once by the Israelis and the second time by the Shia militia Amal. It has been completely destroyed and reconstructed and rebuilt by the refugees themselves. It's all completely informal. There is absolutely no regulation in this space, and as you can see, it's completely, there is densification of the housing, and with extremely narrow streets. But it really looks like, more or less, for those who know slums or these kind of neighborhoods in the region, it really looks like any other neighborhood, poor neighborhood in the southern suburbs of Beirut, for example. So we really have a densification, and the only thing that differentiates this area with some other poor neighborhoods at the same place is all these political things that you can see, the faces of Palestinian flag, you can see the Palestinian political parties. So it's still very, very marked by the presence of political parties, Palestinian political parties. But this camp, as such, is now composed by less than 50% of Palestinians inside. Most of them are Syrians, Iraqis, poor Lebanese, and economic migrants from Southeast Asia. Because it's a very poor area, very cheap area. And so the Palestinians, they just build new flats on the top and rent it to the migrants. Here we go to the south of Lebanon, in Tyre. It's an old refugee camp that used to be an Armenian refugee camp, opened by the French during the French Mandate. And now it's a Palestinian refugee camp since 1948. And we have exactly the same process. If you look at this overall picture on the left, it's on the right for you, it really looks like a city. It's a big, big refugee camp. And if you look on the other picture on the other side, it's new buildings that have been constructed illegally to accommodate refugees from Syria, whether Syrian refugees or Palestinians from Syria. So you have an overall development of new buildings inside the camp since 2011 with the mass arrival of this more than 1 million of Syrian refugees. So the need for accommodation has completely boosted the construction inside the camps. And so it's one of the ways to say that it's not really a space of exception now, because it really becomes like many, many of the poor informal areas and poor informal neighborhoods in the Lebanese city, where they had a boom in the construction linked to the mass arrival of refugees. So they have this role of accommodating, because it's cheap, because it's informal, so of course it can accommodate a lot of refugees. And you can see on the other picture here in Shatila, when I told you that it was like you have more than half of the population are not Palestinians, now you have a lot of Bangladeshi that are the poorest economic migrants in Lebanon. It's the poorest one. It's in the most recently arrived. It's the last large group of economic migrants who arrived in Beirut. And so they opened a lot of shops in Shatila neighborhood. And they squat in some of the buildings left by the Palestinians. And you have a really mix between this population and a form of integration of this population. And I'm witnessing this process is now like 10 years with a gradual importance and arrival of other groups of migrants in this neighborhood. And on the other pictures, you can see other forms of urban integration of refugees. At the background of the photo, you can see this big building, and you have on the right side for you, you have a small place where Syrian refugees have squatted a small apartment in this unoccupied big building. And just in front, you have these trees, and on the other side, you have a small place where you have Syrian refugees, a Syrian family who settled. So you have these different kinds of forms of integration in the city that are complementary to this densification of the refugee camps. And what about, now to finish, because of the time I'm running quite out of time, Zaatari camp in Jordan. It was a completely empty place before 2011. It's 12 kilometers from the first small city of Mafraq in north of Jordan. And now it looks like this. I mean, it's an area where you have like 80,000 refugees. This is the urban growth of the refugee camp. So step by step, with the arrival of refugees, and you can see that it has been organized very strictly by the UNHCR and the Jordanian authorities. And you can see this picture just to show you the evolution of the different kinds of housing inside the camp. At the very beginning, it was like on the first picture, just a few tents, isolated, one from the other, for a very limited period of time for the refugees. And then, step by step, they have developed in prefabricated housing has been distributed to the refugees, and they began to transform it. This is the kind of work we do with the architects. We try, through interviews, to reconstruct the evolution of the housing of several families inside the camp. And so this is more or less the evolution of the typical evolution. It is one family, but it really fits to many, many other families. And what we can see is that we have a progressive development of units that looks like what they had before in the countryside in Syria. They tried to reconstruct the same kind of houses, a private space, at several rooms, kitchen, meeting room, and so on and so forth. So this was the camp at the beginning. This picture had been taken in 2014 when I was there. So families were seen living in tents. Now you hardly find a family living in a tent in the camp. It no longer exists. But they have developed all this kind of informal workshop to try to reconstruct what they have been given by the NGOs and international community, because it doesn't fit their own. For example, they distribute like units of housing units, but it's not connected to other things, and you don't have a private space when you go out. So they destroy it, they cut it. Of course, it's completely informal and not allowed by the authority. And so they completely transform the housing in order to build what look like a small house. And so you really have a process of building houses, of building a private space in the camp. And parallel to this development of housing unit at a very, very small scale, at the level of the family, you have a completely informal and illegal development of huge commercial areas. And that's what you can witness here. It looks like a city, because they have redeveloped the traditional way of doing souks, markets in the Arab cities. And they have developed a lot of places, of public spaces, like restaurants, like cafes, like barbers, barber shop, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of development, and it's completely illegal and completely not supported by the UNHCR, and completely not supported by, of course, by the Jordanian authorities. But they have really tried to develop a model of a city with a city center, with a marketplace, with several neighborhoods organized by themselves, and trying to build step by step a city by their own. So that's why I wanted to finish on this aspect. And thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. We will discuss it later on, but yeah. So now we will have a presentation of Camille Gardesse, who is from Paris East University, and I don't know the official English name of Ecole d'Urbanisme de Paris.
I'm not sure. Probably okay. Like Paris
so
Urban
Ecole d'Urbanisme de Paris.
Urban Planning School.
This is perfect. So the word is yours for 20 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I will mostly speak about camps in Paris, but first I will present some elements about the European situation. It's quite different, actually, regarding what you just presented, but that's also interesting to compare it. Over the last few years, migrant populations living in great precarity have become increasingly visible on the streets of Europe's major cities. And they are often referred to as refugees, and their occupation of public spaces, in particular in a camp phenomena, has been the focus of public and media debate. But first of all, it needs to be pointed out that the reasons for migrations of this population are as diverse as the social situations of the populations in question. And for example, that's true that many migrants are fleeing conflict in their home country, but there is also a minority, often being present for a longer period, who is, we can say, economic migrant, and who can't apply for asylum. Also, I would like to say that most of the migrants I will speak of are from Afghanistan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Sudan, but there are also some Moroccans, some Tunisians, some Ivorians and Malians in the camps. And if in general the immigrants who have spent time in the camps are young men aged between 18 and 30 years old, there are also families like couples with children or women with children, or there are also lone women, there are also underages alone. Some only arrived really recently, some want to cross on their way to another country, others arrived several years ago, so there is a lot of differences in the profiles of the migrants. But despite these differences, the populations in public spaces share two common denominators. One is that they are all on a migratory route and have arrived in France for either a long-term period or just in transit towards another country. And two, they are all in high-risk living conditions that do not allow for simple and secure access to housing and services in the city. Beyond understanding these different profiles of population, which I will not explore in depth today, actually, the study of their settlement in and also the study of their use of urban spaces provides concrete examples and raises questions about the host country's immigrant reception policy. And from this perspective, the city can be considered as both as a pertinent analytical framework and also a vital research field for understanding these migratory phenomena. So for reasons that have long been identified since Chicago School, large cities are typically the first choice of settlement for migrant population. I won't speak about that. I just want to say that the process of establishing immigrants on a territory is also mainly handled by urban actors, national and local public authorities, but also city inhabitants who are playing a key role that maybe I will discuss later, if I have time. And yes, also I would like to say that the situation that I will discuss today are relevant to homeless people in general, but I believe that it's important to specifically consider the immigrant condition, for it defines actually the material parameters of a person's establishment and also the ethnic questions we discussed earlier. So given these outlines and in a European context, how can we frame the relationship between city precarious immigrants and asylum? So first of all, this term of asylum contains a double meaning, at least. A first meaning of openness, whereby asylum in a city means hospitality, shelter, integration, and a second meaning of imprisonment, referring to the locking out of deviant, abnormal, or undesirable populations. And this dichotomy was, yes, the starting point for a research program that I am participating in called Babels, yes, probably in English. It stands for, yes, I always said it in French, but it stands for Borders Analysis and Borders Ethnographies in Liminal Situations. It's also a French ANR. And yes, in Europe, citizen and also institutional conceptions of migrant reception are recently really evolved, particularly since 2015, which was a period of intense media coverage on the subject with mass drownings in Mediterranean Sea, the German response for welcoming refugees from the Middle East, and European debates over the distribution of refugee intake, and also the opening or closing of several national frontiers. So in this context, different forms of institutional but also individual hospitality were widely promoted. But at the same time, some government officials, some media, some citizens also called for rejection and marginalization of refugees or even migrants. In France, for example, different town mayors publicly declared their hospitality and organized accommodation for migrants, while others really expressed a total hostility to any form of migrant reception. So taking into account these different factors, the Babels Research Collective has organized its research around 3 themes: the border cities, the crossroad cities, and the refuge cities. I won't speak specifically about border cities and crossroad cities. Maybe Camille Schmoll will say a few words about Nicosia, or the field research conducted in Nicosia, which is one of the border city of the Babel program. But the principal subject of my paper today is refuge cities. And as I said, the mayors of certain towns, such as Paris, but also Berlin, have publicly declared their cities to be refuge cities. And at Babels, we have taken this announcement seriously in order to both study the application for rights made by immigrants in these cities, and also to understand the possibility of, in the post-crisis period, the ways in which immigrants' populations settle long-term in refuge cities, settle or don't, actually. And in looking at refuge cities, a common theme emerges, that of the appearance of migrant camps, not of the outskirts of European capital city, but really in the center, like the Maximilian Park in Brussels, or Oranienplatz in Berlin, or in Paris. I will show you a map later. And these new urban spaces are redefining collective and public action in cities concerning asylum seekers. So to speak about these different themes, I will focus today on the situation in Paris, considered from 3 angles: urban forms and places, urban people involved, and urban planning and urban policies issues. Not sure I will have time to speak about the 3, but let's try. So yes, different factors must first be taken into account in order to qualify and to describe, I will try to do that, the urban spaces that have been formed and also transformed, actually, by their occupation by precarious immigrant populations. So I will briefly present a chronological summary of the Paris situation, highlighting the different urban configurations that can be described as camps, but this term of camp, and also in regard as what you presented, this term of camp can be debated in the Parisian context. The Babels research program uses the term camp regarding the Parisian situation also, or Berlin, but it's in reference to and also to distinguish it from other forms of camp, like maybe closed in the case of prison model camp, or at the border camps, etc. But I will also discuss other modes of urban establishment by precarious migrants, such as the occupation of public buildings. And for these situations, we can question whether the problematic is the same as street camps, whether the type of place, I mean street or building, merits distinct reflection, or whether they are comparable. I will use the term eviction to speak about public action intended to move people from street camps, and public authorities are referring to this as dismantling, so they are using another word. And they also speak of evacuation when the evictions are accompanied with accommodation solutions. So there is a lot of words, and maybe we can try to figure out and discuss them later. For the Babel's Paris research team, the starting point for the recent period is the date of 2nd of June 2015. Because on this day, a migrant street camp that had been growing for several months under the elevated metro tracks at the La Chapelle intersection in Paris was evacuated by the Paris City Hall and by the Paris Prefecture in front of dozens of cameras. And actually, it was quite the first spectacular evacuation of a street camp in public Parisian space, and it was soon to be followed by many more. So this day, the 2nd of June 2015, was for us like a beginning of a cycle that has left a mark on Parisian public space. So it's a cycle of street camps set up by people in a precarious situation of migration, a matching cycle of evacuation of these camps by public authorities, and also it marks the emergence of a movement of solidarity by residents of Paris and Île-de-France. Solidarity towards migrant people living in the streets. In the first phase of camps emergence, people sleep directly on the ground or on cardboard pieces with nothing to eat, with no decent sanitary provisions, but immediately local residents, neighbors, members of associations and charities, and also some political activists appeared with material help for the migrants, initially in the form of just protective materials like mattresses, tents, sleeping bags, and also food. So I just here some pictures of the camps, of some camps, here also, and also a picture of an evacuation with a lot of policemen and the bus behind them who will bring these people to some refuge structure. And between June 2015 and November 2016, the spaces of these street camps were situated, as you can see on the map, in the heart of the city, in the heart of Paris. They are most of all structured by a specific connection or a specific proximity to access point to the city, la Gare du Nord, Gare de l'Est, and Gare d'Austerlitz in particular. They are also close to administrative centers, in particular in Jaurès camp under the Metro Line 2. I think you can see here. This is the France Terre d'Asile offices, and this is where immigrants must lodge their asylum request. And also the general spreading of information led to the recurring nature of camps in these precise spots, because it became common knowledge among certain immigrant populations that upon arrival in Paris, one must first of all go to Gare de l'Est or go to La Chapelle or go to Stalingrad. So after each evacuation of camp, several weeks went and new bigger camps reappeared to then await for their own occupation. So that's a cycle. And at the same time, several public buildings were occupied. So I will speak about two experiences. One is on July 2015, some of people who were evacuated from a La Chapelle street camp joined up with local residents from a collective, which is La Chapelle en lutte. I don't know exactly how to translate it, to occupy an empty building, the former Jean Carré High School in Paris 19th arrondissement. And the objective was both concrete, as in providing a roof over the head of migrants living on the street for several weeks, and also political, by drawing public authorities' attention to the reality of migrant reception and living conditions in France. And this squat, for 3 months, this squat was open to the public and housed an increasing number of migrants. What is also interesting is that during this week, other local residents became mobilized, actually, in support of the Jean Carré immigrants, such as neighbors, people who are living in this building, for example, just behind the Jean Carré squat. And these concerned neighbors demanded from the local and also from Paris City Hall that the high school be evacuated and that long-term accommodation solution be found for all the migrants. And so finally, 3 months later, in October 2015, the public authorities organized an evacuation at a time of peak occupation for the squat, with 1,300 people evacuated this day. And several months later, I won't speak a lot about that, but there were another occupation in April 2016 in another former empty school in Paris 19th arrondissement, which is Jean Jaurès School. And this was several of the Jean Carré occupants who proposed to people sleeping in a Stalingrad camp to occupy this new building with the important idea that the action should be political, not just waiting for another evacuation, but really speak about the conditions of living for these people. So yes, there is a lot of differences, but really what I can say is that the story of this occupation was fundamentally different in terms of political and police response, because unlike Jean Carré, in Jean Carré, the occupation lasted for several weeks and also included periods of negotiation with public authorities, but in Jean Jaurès, the squat was evacuated by the police after just 12 days of occupation, and no accommodation solutions were proposed. And also a lot of migrants were issued with a notice of obligation to leave the French territory. So there is a third type of camp in Paris, actually, and currently, because the last big evacuation of a camp was in November 2016, the 4th. It was a really big evacuation of a camp between Stalingrad and Jaurès station, comprising approximately 4,000 people in the street. And this was to be the last street camp in Paris to date, because for soon afterwards, the city of Paris opened at Porte de la Chapelle a reception center, initially called a reception camp, but they changed the name, a center for asylum seekers intended to prevent them from setting up street camps. So this is, the name now is Humanitarian Center, Paris Nord. It's to welcome first-time arrivals and likely asylum seekers in France. Yes, it's okay, quite okay. It can house up to 400 people, and it's managed by Emmaus. So I won't speak a lot about that, but just to say that maybe the creation of this humanitarian center did not bring about the disappearance of street camps, quite the contrary actually, because its reception capacity is insufficient. So a fortnight after the opening of this center, a new migrant camp set up, but not inside Paris, just a few meters away of the center on the Avenue du Président Wilson in Saint-Denis. And it has also been evacuated shortly afterwards. So I don't have time to speak about people, but I'm not surprised. Maybe we will speak about that later. I just wanted to show you, but you can't read it. Anyway, and it's just a working, yes. We are currently working on this actors map just to try to identify all the actors involved in this story, in this cycle of street camps in Paris. And I will use my 5 minutes just to speak about urban planning and urban policies issues. The first issue is the question of visibility and invisibility of migrants in public space. Because from the perspective of migrants and also from their supporters, we can say, in the occupation of public spaces and buildings, their visibility and also the denunciation of their living conditions in France are at stake. And the cycle of street camps and their evacuation clearly illustrates that the street camp is a way for migrants to bring their situation to public attention and potentially obtain access to shelter and accommodation, because the prefecture and the Paris City Hall organized evacuations when the camps became too big, so too visible. But inversely, the reactive installation of different urban design features suggests that public authorities, and that's on both a municipal and a national level, are more in favor of invisibilization of these populations, because after each evacuation, we can see here that the Paris City Hall systematically settled fences, like here, with the result that nearly all of the space between La Chapelle and Stalingrad is now entirely closed off. And also recently, some rocks, big rocks, as you can see, were settled in the spaces just near the humanitarian center, where migrants were sleeping actually whilst awaiting the opening of the center. So these urban walks just make impossible to set up a new camp or to just sleep in these spaces. And there is, yes, I just want to say that in other cases, urban works, like here, have taken the form of facilities for other urban populations. Like, for example, here you can see it's on Avenue de Flandre, where a really big camp was settled. But after the evacuation, tennis tables were settled instead. But there is other examples that I can speak of. So this urban works is also reinforced by police intervention in public space and lead to the confiscation of blankets or the dispersion of migrants around the city to precisely avoid their regrouping and avoid street camps. And yes, we can speak about that later. Just two more points and I finish. One is the fact that the city of Paris is communicated on its unconditional conception of migrant reception, of migrant welcoming, in particular during the opening of the humanitarian center. But several members of the Babel's team, who prefer to remain anonymous right for the moment, have observed inside the camp, actually, another discourse, we can say, one of migrant flow management, which is a particularly visible issue, given that there are always more migrants in front of the center, yes, we can see it there, that it can actually accommodate on a daily basis. And inside the center, inside this bubble, so that's the welcoming bubble, there is an admission interview, which is actually called a welcome interview, accueil, un entretien d'accueil. And it consists of a series of binary questions that allow for a questionnaire to be completed, creating categories according to which new arrivals can or cannot be admitted. And the point is to facilitating the flow of people. So the questions are just binary, like male, female, minor, adult, new or not, both playing Greece, Italy, fingerprints, no fingerprints, etc. So the interview is a process aimed at sorting and categorizing people in order to send them to other structures as quickly as possible. But all the migrants who are going in this center are not systematically housed by the center, obviously, and they are not automatically neither redirected to other refuge, because a lot are just sent back to the streets. And also because the number of places in emergency refuge structures for migrants in general is quite insufficient in Paris region, actually. Which leads me to my third point, and I just, it's over after that, which is about the example of the Jean Carré Refuge Center, because the Jean Carré occupation raised awareness about the site and seemed to have rewritten its urban destiny. Because an emergency refuge center managed by Emmaus also, was opened there on February 2016, so a few months after the evacuation, with 145 places for migrant people. And this new orientation was announced as beginning as temporary, because the site was already flagged for the construction of a library. But we can see that the building's occupation by migrants and their supporters appears to have provided the momentum for the strategic and political reorientation of the site, because since September 2016, this temporary nature of the refuge seems to be under reconsideration by the managing public authorities, who is the Paris City Hall. And Paris seemed to no longer question the essential role of the site in the reception and housing of precarious immigrant populations. So a revised project may be studied currently that would maintain the refuge and also build the library alongside it. So if this turns out to be the case, the site's key role in welcoming migrants will be confirmed as a long-term mission. And I think that these changes in the programming of this place highlight some difficulties of governance and also some lack of clarity on behalf of the responsible public body, the Paris City Hall, in conceiving a sustainable and stable project for hosting precarious migrants. And this difficulty can be understood given the constraints of national migratory policies that can complicate decision-making at the local level, actually, regarding this question. But fundamentally, from a planning point of view, it also reveals an absence of anticipation in migrant intake policy, as well as an absence of ambition in the initial programming of the former high school. Yes. Thank you.
So, hello. Thanks to the organizer for the invitation, and thanks for the two very interesting presentations. So I will try to be somehow coherent. As you maybe you have noticed, the ghost of Michel Agier is present here. Everybody quotes, so I will also quote Michel Agier. And following Michel Agier's suggestions, to consider camps as a globalized and world-spread phenomenon, we can, and I think that's what we do in this session, consider camps as a quite banal reality spread over the world, and of increasing importance, due also to the increasing importance of refugees and displaced people in the world. I think it's important to point at this because due to the recent migration flows increase in Europe, sometimes we have the tendency to be a little bit Eurocentric and to consider that this is so specific to Europe or so new. Instead, there are millions of refugees in the world, millions of displaced people. Drawing on Michel Agier, but I think this is official data. There are 450 official refugee camps in the world, hosting 6 million refugees, 600 camps hosting internally displaced persons, and there are probably much more of those camps hosting 6 million people, and many autonomous camps, thousands and thousands of autonomous camps, such as jungles, ghettos, and so on. And interestingly enough, Michel Agier also includes in this category of the camp as a global form the issue of detention facilities, detention centers that we didn't raise now, and I don't think we will, because it will put us just too far from what we have heard. So just to say that it's a widespread phenomenon. It covers very different spatial realities, such as borderlands, rural areas, urban interstices. Sorry, of course, I will focus on the issue of urban and city level. And so, with this widespread reality, we have also a very powerful imaginary of the camp as a meaning, there is also an aesthetic of the camp. So now it seems like we are in the EU, we are rediscovering an issue which actually is not quite new. And when for instance, Kamel did his PhD, did we say 15 years ago, sorry. Probably this, for scholars working on the EU, it was less interesting for us, and it was more exotic, let's say. It's less now. Okay. So what we have seen, listening to these presentations, is that the camp is nothing but a chaotic reality. Your two presentation raised two issues about camps that are, I think, quantitative and qualitative, if I may say so, I don't know. So the issue of number, let's say, which is, of course, you raised, especially Kamel, the extremely important demographic impact of the recent migration inflow, and this is an important question that has been raised in the various sessions. I think it's also the issue of if those numbers are so important, let's say so, what is now the mainstream society, and we can also think about at the urban level, whose is the city, and of course by asking whose is the city, we also ask, and probably this is what you raised in your presentation, Camille, this is what you raised, who has the right to the city, which is something very important and complicated. Second point, qualitative, it's about urbanities or urbanism. I don't know how to say actually. Like in, I will also quote Chicago School, but maybe more in Louis Vier's version, like the camp as a urban way of life, and so we can find all the aspects of urban way of life in the camp. So density, diversity, heterogeneity, and so this raises the issues of how do we dwell, how do we cohabit in the camp, how do people inhabit the camp, and I was very interested when you showed the many activities that are going on into the camps, like businesses and so on. So what's in a camp? I think we can, to resume what you said and try to raise a few questions, we can talk about the ambivalence of the camp and a few tensions that can help us to analyze the camp as a figure, just to follow Agier, as a form. So the first tension would be the tension between permanent and temporary forms, of course, and past and present. So you showed very well, Kamel, there is an historicity of the camp. And this raise, I wanted to ask you about the issue of the memory of the camps and maybe some cycles, as you said, you use the word cycles of destruction and I don't know, I don't like resilience, but some rebuilding, I don't know, how would you call it? So what is the relation with this in the camp? And so, of course, the issue of history is important also when it comes to France, because we have a long history of encampment, though it's not connected maybe that much to these new waves of migration, but we have a very long history, and for instance, in southwestern France with Spaniards and so on. So how do you think somehow this issue can be raised, and how, Camille? So, of course, it's also a way to discuss the idea of the new, the fact that this issue is new, it's not. Second tension, maybe, between the issue of auto-organization, like the camp as a space as it autonomously organized, and you raised the issue of safety in the camps, which I found very interesting, but you didn't talk a lot about this, Kamel. You talked about the new migrants that can feel, illegal migrants that can feel safe. So why do they feel safe in the camp? So the issue of autonomy of refugees as making the city, as city makers, I think it's really interesting, and this tension between this autonomy and the issue of the state, UN agencies, municipalities, and so on. So who runs, who organizes the camps, and why is it important to understand whose the camp is? Also, this is connected also to the issue of why is it important for the camp to be in the city. Like many of the protests, of the migrant protests in Paris were about, we don't want to be resettled in like rural parts of France, in the middle of nowhere. We want to stay in Paris. So I think that's an important issue also. Third tension, very classic tension when we study migration, and we talk about it a lot of times today, is tension between mobility, enclosure and circulation, so it can be interpreted in many ways. You worked on the relation between margin and centers, which is of course very important, but we can also think about how does a camp circulate as a model of living, and I am not sure what I mean by that, but I would like to know what you think about it. And so how can you rethink the relation between center and periphery through the camp? Is there a circulation between the different camps you study, Kamel? And what about, so very different, but yes, this is the idea of the camp as a model. Camille, what about, you talked a little bit about Paris as a welcoming city, but I was wondering how did, because I didn't really follow the issue, how did Paris negotiate, or didn't negotiate actually, the fact of being part of this network of welcoming city? Because I think it lost an opportunity. I mean, she claimed, the mayor of Paris, she claimed to be a welcoming city, and then she completely lost the opportunity. It was a wonderful opportunity to be with other cities, as you well know, as Athens, Palermo, Barcelona, and so on. And then she got lost. I don't know what happened. I think it's a matter of scales, but it will be another question. Another tension, the issue, of course, of exception. It was in the abstract of the session, so I need to raise it. And so you said there is this tension between emergency, exception, and normality in the camp. So I was wondering, first of all, to which extent can we compare the camp with other forms of precarious temporary livings, like, I don't know, roulottes, or, I don't know, informal neighborhood. The big issue being, of course, what do we do with Agamben? You didn't mention him, so I think we can also keep Agamben very far, but I was interesting anyway, because I think the issue of space of exception, of necropolitics and so on is very much linked to the EU context, the issue of death camps, and so I'm wondering, what do we do with this? I think one of the interests of Agamben was also to bring Foucault to us, but you didn't mention Foucault, so I guess maybe the issue of if we think as a camp, as a dispositif, we probably need Foucault to think about it, and also if we think about, because your presentation made me think very much about a paper, I don't know if you know this paper of Nick Gill, which is a geographer, and he wrote a paper on new state theorization of refugee management, or I don't remember exactly the title, and he has a Foucauldian approach to the state, which I think is interesting when you want to take into consideration the very different figures of the states that are involved in the management of the camp. I don't know if I'm very clear. And maybe the last point would be the tension. It's not my last point, but about these tensions between legitimacy and illegitimacy. What is the position of those migrants in the moral geographies of the city? What I find quite interesting in the case of Paris is that two of the big centers that have been built to host those refugees are outside Paris. So it raises an issue of who has a legitimacy to be in the public space, the issue of undesirable people, as you said. But it raised also an issue of scales, because it's another question: what is the role of municipalities in the process of encampment? I think we are typically in Paris in a case of conflicting scales, and but it's complicated. I mean, there are many actors involved, and for instance, you have also the local municipalities outside Paris that have. I'm a bit obsessed with this, but Paris is a big city made of many cities, so there is not only the city of Paris, there are also only other cities, and so what are relations with these different mayors, for instance, local municipalities? And I had the same question for Kamel, who is involved? Are there any local actors like municipalities involved in the government of the camps or not? And maybe I will stop there. It's enough.
Thank you, Camille, for this discussion. I think there are a lot of questions to address, so maybe you may pick some in order to leave some time for other questions.
Yeah, I can start. Yes. Thanks for those very interesting and stimulating questions. I would just pick some of them just to. Well, the first thing is a remark more than but it comes. It can also reply to some of the questions. It's interesting because here in Europe, one of the processes, especially in France, is to hide the refugees and to destroy the camps in order to avoid any kind of visibility. In the Middle East, the very existence of the refugee camp is just to put light and to shed light on the situation of the refugees. I mean, the Jordanian authorities have opened a camp for less than 20% of the refugees, so it's not to manage the flow and the influx. They cannot manage because the people are crossing the border, whatever they want, or not to take them in the city, in Jordan. But they just opened the camp to show the international community that it exists, that there is a problem with the refugees, and that they need assistance and they need money. So it's like an advertising. So it's just to put visibility and to show what they want to show. And it's one of the reasons why they don't want that the camp developed so much, because they have to be population in need in order to bring money. So it's, I mean, it's a political perspective, and it's exactly the same thing for the Palestinian situation. The camp cannot disappear as long as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not solved. So it's a way to show that there is a political problem and there is a need for assistance for these people. So, I mean, the camp is putting in visibility, so they don't want to, so they build camp in certain areas in order to shed the light on certain population, and of course they want them to disappear from other parts of the city. Which means that they don't have access, for example, to the capital, to Amman, for example, and in Beirut they try to avoid the presence, except in certain areas of the city. They try to put like invisibility for the refugees in certain part and visibility in other part for the international community. So invisibility for the host society, but visibility for the international community. And this is completely linked to legitimacy and the access to the city. I think that it's one of the parts that we put them in a camp because it's very specific population that are in the camp. It's not all the Syrians. For example, in Jordan, it's a specific group coming from the south part of Syria that is it's considered to be like dangerous because the revolution began in Daraa, and for example in Zaatari camp it's mostly people from the Daraa area, and the other camp in Azraq it's mostly people from Palmyra, and people from Palmyra was taken by Daesh, so by the Islamic State, so considered to be dangerous. So it's really there is a selection process of who will be in the camp and who will be outside of the camp. So it's really an access to the city and access to the society. And so in terms of legitimacy, you will never find someone coming from a middle-class refugee coming from Damascus or Aleppo will never be in a refugee camp. You will not find a single example of this. It's only poor, remote people considered as being dangerous. So there is a selection, social, class, and political selection of the refugees. In terms of autonomy, this is very interesting, I think, because this has a link, it can link the two presentations. And when we had a public conference in Amman in January, and the question was, what is a camp? And we were discussing with our colleagues who are architects and urban planners that normally we try to read and to see the camp through the lens of the city. So what can we learn from the city in order to improve the situation in the camp? And some of the architects just wanted to put it on the, and especially it was a Syrian architect, in fact. He said that we have to look at it differently. He worked extensively and since a long time on Palestinian refugee camps, and he said, what can camps teach us to develop the cities? Because in terms of autonomy, in terms of self-organization, and in terms, for example, of safety, of social control, it's much more developed and much more innovative than most of the informal areas in Beirut or in Amman. So what can we learn from the camp to improve the situation in the city and not the other way around? So this is also another perspective to try to deconstruct the question of space of exception. And that's why I'm not quoting Agamben and so on and so forth, because I think that it's a perspective, because it has been developed in a specific historical context that is completely legitimate in itself, but it doesn't fit all the kind of situation. And I think that we can read the city through the lens of the camp. So what can we learn from the camp experience? And not put it like as an exception aside that we cannot compare with anything else. And this is one of the main problems. I mean, in Amman, we were quite the first time that we made a comparison publicly between Palestinians and other groups of refugees. That is politically impossible to do, because you compare what shouldn't be compared only for political reasons. So it was quite hard even to impose this. But we managed to do it with Palestinians, with Syrians, and with French scholars. So this was quite interesting to manage to do this. Try to go out of the exception and to put it in the overall social debate on how cities can be analyzed and construct. Well, I will stop here.
Okay, thank you. I won't answer neither all the questions, obviously, but thank you very much for all the comments. Just to react about, we can say the governance issue actually between the city of Paris and also a national level of policy, because the decision by the city of Paris to open this humanitarian center can really underline the governance difficulties actually of the situation, because the municipality must manage the installation of these populations in public spaces, while the national policies do not supply the means for organizing and, yes, to accommodate systematically or rapid or quickly these populations. And actually, when the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, was presented in May 2016, the project of humanitarian center, it was quite a surprise for everyone, even the urban services. I mean, even the technicians inside the Paris City Hall were surprised and were concerned, because they were thinking, how will we manage this center? But for Anne Hidalgo, it was quite a way, we can say, to oblige the national administration to face up of the responsibility of this arrival. And yes, maybe I just can also say that you're totally right about this question of history regarding migrant population sleeping in the streets. And also, as I said, but really quickly, this situation for a lot of people sleeping in the streets. So that's why I wonder about the specificity of migrant condition in this situation, obviously, and also that's a choice, we can say, for Babel's research team to focus on the situation called crisis, but we could discuss of the crisis also term, and also of this appearance of camps inside, on the public spaces, on the Parisian public spaces inside Paris, because as you said, the two centers, I just spoke about the center, humanitarian center in Porte de la Chapelle, but there is also another one, just opened recently in Ivry, which is also really near suburb, and this is from women with children and families, and it's in the building belonging to the city of Paris, but in Ivry. And you're right, I mean, obviously there were a choice by the city of Paris to put these camps, these humanitarian camps, at the outskirts of the city and not inside. So obviously this is the question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think now if we can take a round of questions. If does someone have a question? Olivier?
Just to kick off the discussion, further the discussion. I think the contrast between the strategies of visibilization in the case of Jordan and the case of invisibilization in Paris is interesting. And I would like to relate it, probably a bit too blunt, but anyway, to the session we had this morning on spatial assimilation, because you mentioned, Camille, that you would speak about solidarity movements in Paris, which you did not develop too much in the end. But what about this idea that the idea of having migrants, the abstract idea of having migrants in the neighborhood is really strongly opposed by, I would say, majority of people, but then having real migrants next to your doorstep is a very different experience. So is there any kind of opening there? And in which case, of course, the strategy of the city of Paris of trying to move migrants in the neighboring municipalities is another thing, because then the same solidarities can apply. But migrant camps, such as the one in Porte de la Chapelle, is very striking that it's as remote as possible from any kind of vicinity, neighborhood. It's probably one of the rare spaces in Paris that is not close to any kind of neighborhood. So it's interesting. Maybe.
Yes, I think that it's really interesting to see that the local residents in Paris during this period of street camps have really become systemic actors of this question. So there are, yes, some local residents who are opposed to the migrants. There are also people just like that don't care or they don't really mind about that. But I just really can speak about the people who were involved in support to the migrants, because that was the research I made. And I think what is really interesting regarding your question is that finally the proximity of the migrants camps, of the migrants settlement in the streets, the proximity of these migrants' presence with their residents is a central reason for the involvement. They speak a lot about the doorstep situation, like I had to do something because it was just in front of me in the streets on my doorstep. And what is also interesting is that a lot of these people, I don't have really the time to do some precise sociological approach, but a lot of these people were not activists before this involvement for the migrants sleeping in the streets. So it's really like, because they were confronted to this situation, that they became activists, urban activists. And I think that made them, in a way, that made them citizens, or that made them city inhabitants. So yes, this is a really interesting question.
Another question? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Dima Al-Khouri. I'm a doctorant at the University of Caen, and I work on the issue of Syrian urban refugees in Lebanon. And so I thought it was a very interesting presentation. Thank you. And I'm not sure how it happens in Jordan, but what's interesting to note, or I would like to hear your ideas on the fact that the Lebanese government did not accept Syrians since the beginning of the conflict as refugees. Neither is it a signatory of the 1951 Convention on one hand, and on the second hand, Syrians who have entered Lebanon have entered either under a tourist status or as a migrant status, or economic migrant status. And most recently, since 2015, they have as well increased the tension on the case of Syrian refugees by adding the issue of kafala. So now Syrians in Lebanon are refugees, but they are not accepted as refugees officially, and they have to have an economic migrant status, but they have to sign a guarantee that they will not be working at the same time. So they are placed effectively outside the law, however they act. And there being no official camps, this also increases. I was just wondering if you had any interviews or have any ideas or thoughts on that specific situation today.
It's more or less the same situation for Jordan. Since 2014, they have to have a specific visa that was not imposed before. So I think that it's different. The question implies different sets of answers. The first thing that pre-existing the 2011 war in Syria, there was bilateral agreements between Lebanon and Syria, and between Jordan and Syria concerning labor migration and visa policy towards entry. So at the beginning of the conflict, all the Syrians were entering the country under these bilateral agreements. In terms of, it didn't change in Jordan for those who entered before 2013 on the residency right. Now the border is completely closed, as it's the case in Lebanon, and Lebanon has completely stopped these bilateral agreements. I mean, so they are not allowed now to work and so on and so forth. And even now, they are not even allowed to register at the UNHCR. So even if, I mean, these countries are not signatory of the Geneva Convention, but still they have memorandum of understanding between the government and the UNHCR. So still you have the UNHCR act as the one who gives asylum and refugee status, combined with, I mean, the residency right. Well, I think that one of the reasons why it's these countries are in this situation, it's still because they perceive refugee movement through the eyes of the Palestinian experience. They don't want to reproduce the Palestinian experience because they don't want that these populations settle on the long term, and especially for Lebanon, it's a quarter of the population. It's huge numbers, of course. It's combined with a very, very, very liberal and flexible labor market. So it's a way of lowering the wages. And indeed, it has lowered the wage in a very, very dramatic way for many, many Lebanese and many, many Palestinians and Syrians who were there before. And it's the same thing in Jordan. There is a whole policy of replacement, for example, of Egyptian labor workers by Syrians. More skilled, less expensive, because they don't have any legal access to the labor market. So it's informality. So I think that there is a whole way of putting a pressure on the people in order to push them to go back to Syria when the situation will be better, and that it's not the case. And the second element is that it's a real economic perspective of lowering the wages and having a very, very low, flexible manpower. And this is something that is quite common in the Middle East with this blurring categories between refugees, economic migrant, illegal migrants, and then you can do whatever you want with the migrants, and you can expel them whenever you want. You can give them access or not to the labor market, give them access to many, many rights. So I think that it's something that is quite common.
Well, thank you. I think we are reaching the end of the session and also the end of the workshop. Thank you. I'm supposed to say a few words of conclusions. So first, on behalf of the organizer, I thank all the participants especially those who came from abroad, and also all the special thanks to all the speakers who made a presentation today. I think I don't. It's not really possible to summarize what have been said today, especially in a few minutes. But I think that what we've seen is that we are reaching a new stage within internationalization of cities, with, for example, the diversity of minorities, and in some case, the fact that there's not even any, let's say, majority, or maybe even any minorities, because everybody is in the minority, so this is the majority case, if I may say. And this raised a lot of questions. I mean, there's still a lot of research to be made. It not only those changes, for example, but not only question the integration process, this also redefine what integration is or may be. This also raised question about the classical opposition. We discussed that this morning between national and cosmopolitan. I noticed that cosmopolitan is a word that hasn't been used, in fact, except maybe by me once. The opposition between the local and the global, the mobile and the immobile. This has been also mentioned by one of the Camille this afternoon. And so there's a lot of questions. And something that has been said several times during the day is that we need empirical researchers. This is quite a usual claim, because researchers like to do empirical researches, and so they ask for this. But this is also because there's so many different situations, many different types of flows, from rich to poor country, from poor to rich country. There's different types of social groups involved. There's different situation, different context, depending on the cities, depending on the countries, depending on the neighborhoods, depending also on the policies, and so on. So there's a lot of empirical researches needed in order to document all those different cases. And situation is all the more complicated that reality is obviously ambivalent. Turkish shops, for example, are not always that Turkish. Immigrants should get rid of their ethnic background in order to success economically, but they may as well use their ethnic background to success economically. So both may work. Refugee camps are not always what they look also. Second generation immigrants are integrating on the average, but if you go into details, you may see that the situation of those second generation immigrants is more diverse than the situations of the first generation migrants, and also places which welcome migrants and immigrants are changing in direction that is not the way people that are living in those places are also evolving, are changing on their social position. So reality is complex, and we may, when we look at one, when we do empirical research, we may as well have very different interpretation of it. And this raises one question, which is a very difficult question. We haven't addressed it much. We discussed at some point it, but it's about social policy and the question of what should we do. I mean, people involved in acting upon the world, they may ask us, should we promote ethnic business? And the answers, it looks like maybe it depends. So what may I do with that? And so this is one complicated question, and I think we also may have to think about that